Chapter 5. One Gift, Friendship Rare. "Philip!" Eris whispered fiercely, her fingers clutched around his shoulders. He jerked awake, gasping in air as if he had been drowning, and she backed away from him. The tent was dark and the entrance drawn shut. Night birds called out across the clearing. Crickets chirped in the distance. Joanna snored. Philip rubbed the hand Briar Rose had been holding, the feeling of her fingers lingering, and took a breath to avoid snapping at Eris. For the first time in ages, he had wanted to stay in the dream, and spent as much time as possible with Briar Rose. They had only just cleared the air and met. He started to protest being awake, but Eris held up a single finger to her lips. Her fear made him hesitate. "Eris?" Philip asked, his voice raspy from sleep, as he slowly refocused his attention on the fairy in front of him. "What's wrong?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I have grown quite fond of you." "Oh, no?" Philip sat up. "Save your sarcasm for the next part of this conversation," she said, then glanced at Joanna and touched her temple, putting her into a much deeper sleep. "You remind me of myself when I was younger, uncertain and forgotten, forced into a role you had no desire to take on, and desperate for someone to believe in you. I tried to be good for so long, but I was never good enough." "Until your mentor," Philip said quietly. "Until my mentor. I thought I would never be good enough for anyone." Eris lit the tip of her wand with a pale light, shadowing her face from below. Her eyes reflected gold in the dark. "For her, I was good enough." "Eris, what's wrong?" he asked. "You're acting oddly." "You must listen to me until I am done, Philip," she said, wringing her hands and glancing toward the tent flap. Each look made his skin crawl with fear. "Promise me that. Do not interrupt me. Do not doubt me. Trust me as I trust you." His breath caught and he nodded. "Frike, Poana, and I are Maleficent's apprentices. We disappointed her during the last war, and we have been doing this to get back into her good graces," she said in one breath. A buzz like 1,000 bees filled his ears. He must have misheard her, or she was joking. Eris had promised to teach him magic. She had taught him magic. Maleficent would never want that. "We needed a way to steal the Sword of Truth and the Shield of Virtue so that they could not be used against Maleficent once Princess Aurora's birthday arrived, and you were our way. We assumed having you do it would be a boon to Maleficent. She would find it much more vicious to use you to hurt the kings than to simply use any human to get the armaments." Philip couldn't stop himself from laughing. "What?" "It was a joke. It was the worst joke anyone had ever told." "Maleficent will kill you," said Eris, "but if you are gone, and if I have time to convince her of your usefulness—" "She won't. She took me in after all, but I need time. We only get that if you run." "She can't kill me," he said. "I have the sword. I have the shield. I have magic." Eris's face fell into an expression he hadn't seen from her before, and she shook her head. "Oh, Philip, everything was a ploy I devised to get the arms and distract you from preparing for the curse with your father. You don't have magic. You never did." Philip had been stabbed before. He had been knocked unconscious, on accident and on purpose. He had even heard the snap of his own arm bone as it broke after he fell from a horse. The pain didn't hit until long after each of those hurts. The dark hole of wild terror always overtook him first. It wasn't like panic or fear. It was something deeper, like swimming in a lake and looking down only to notice that you couldn't see the bottom. There was a sharpness to the world that terror and pain brought that let him move forward and get to safety. He knew in those moments that there was an escape for him so long as he kept going. Philip focused on a blade of grass near his feet and urged it to grow and curl around his ankle. It was such a simple magic, the first thing he had been able to do. But nothing happened. He held out his hand and coaxed it forward. Nothing. And the look Eris gave him when she noticed stopped his heart. There was no escaping this. There was no swimming to shore. Philip's chest tightened, and breathing became hard. This was swimming in the depths of a lake, and dingy water without being able to see even his hand before his face, or the predators lurking around him. This was drowning. I'm sorry. I regret lying to you and giving you hope, but there are ways to fix this. Eris drew in a sharp breath through her nose and cracked her knuckles. It's ridiculous, really, but Maleficent went against her principles to train me, and here I find myself going against mine to save you. I was in your position once, and Maleficent offered me her hand. I took it. No, he whispered, and shook his head. He tried to call a breeze, but nothing happened. No, we retrieved the Sword of Truth and the Shield of Virtue to defeat Maleficent. No, you stole them from King Hubert's wizard and King Stephan's mercenaries so that I could deliver them to Maleficent, and they could not be used against her, said Eris. Fairies cannot wield them. To hold them, even, is painful. To move them with magic is something only the most powerful can do, and they cannot do it more than once or twice. That I did not lie about. A hot, jittery feeling filling Philip's skin, coating his palms in sweat and clenching his jaw. His tongue was thick and useless. Words cluttered in his throat. You're joking. You must be joking. Why would anyone spend so much time and effort on a simple robbery? That was the point. We didn't just need you to steal the sword and shield for us. We needed to stall you and keep you away from your father and Altor until Maleficent returned to these lands, and we could turn you over to her. Maleficent loves nothing more than heartache. Lying to you about magic was the easiest way to get your attention and keep it, and we thought it would be the most fun for us. A cruel act, I know. I'm sorry, but you were only the prince then, and now you are Philip, said Eris, shaking her head. Not only did you not have time to prepare for Maleficent, but it was you who stole the sword and shield. It was you tricked, he said, taken and lied to. It was all nothing more than a fate designed to waste his time and break his heart. Was Briar Rose? Maleficent cast us all aside when we could not prevent her defeat, Eris carried on. We had to make her trust us again by lying to me. Was any of it real? The talks and promises? Your specialities? The training? Eris flinched. She had been so kind to him. Poena hadn't been, but she had still taught him. Frank had healed him. She had... Philip brought his hand up to his shoulder, still sore from his fall off the tower, and broadened it, gasping it at the pain. The bruise was gone, but it still hurt. It still hurt because the bruise was still there, because evil fairies couldn't heal. It was all an illusion, he said. The healing, the teaching, the friendship, the promises. The healing should have been his first indication, but he had been so enchanted by the magic and the promise of mentorship, the simple idea that he could exist outside what his father wanted for him, that he hadn't even noticed it. You knew exactly what I wanted, Philip pressed his fist into his chest, his heart beating unbearably hard, and the thought he might be sick. I could never feel my magic, because there wasn't any. It was yours. He hadn't been able to handle fire magic without being burned. He had to tell Eris what his gestures and commands meant before he could do magic. He developed it suddenly for no discernible reason. He wasn't a wizard. He was a jester. You are as human as the rest of them, Eris said, and took his hands in hers. I'm sorry for giving you that false hope. You are talented and clever, but you have no magic. Philip was nothing more than a pawn, always had been and always would be. The carefully built future he had imagined for himself crumbled. There would be no comeuppance for his father, and Philip would not save the day. Eris had elegantly placed him on the board of life and had removed him as quickly. If he had finally found happiness here and it was all a lie, were his dreams fake too? He had been dreaming of Briar Rose for over a decade. But could it all be fake? Was every joy in his life a lie? These weeks may have been a plot, but my warning you now is not, she said sharply, and took him by the shoulders. If you leave and do not return, if your part in this plot against Maleficent is not certain, I can protect you. Maleficent will not follow if you go now. Let the others deal with her, or not. It was never your fight. You want me to leave? He asked, still trying to wrap his mind around it all. Yes, you went on your journey with Joanna. I am simply asking you to go on another one. To Maleficent, you are King Hubert's son and Princess Aurora's future husband. Nothing more. And she will kill you for that unless you do exactly as I say. Abandon this fight against her. Save yourself. Nothing more, he muttered. Like I was, so desperate to do good, and always coming up short, Eris patted his cheek. You will never be good enough for them. Not as you were, and not as you will be, no matter what you do. But you are perfect to me now. Now, said Philip. Now I have nothing. I have less than nothing. I have mistakes. Don't be ridiculous, Eris said, pulling away. You still have me, and I am telling you to flee. I do not have to leave. I do have to leave, he said, his voice soft and distant, as if he were falling far away, sinking deeper into the murky lake of himself. We can't stay here. He glanced at Joanna, asleep and unaware, and Eris startled. Yes, take her, she said. She reached for him again and fiddled with his shirt, fixing his collar and brushing down his hair. Travel away from here. Let Maleficent win, she meant. Should he? All of it? The last few weeks had been for nothing? He had ruined his father's plans. He had ruined everything. He could finally envision the life he wanted, and it was all a lie. All the things he had grown to like about himself were lies. I always run away, he muttered. I thought I was changing, becoming a better Philip, the person I wanted to be. He'd had so many opportunities to do better, and when he had finally taken them, it had all gone wrong. So you are a work in progress, said Eris. Live to be the finished product. The word struck him. Only a little while earlier he had said nearly the same thing to Briar Rose, but from Eris it sounded like mockery. Had he really changed much? It didn't matter. He wasn't a product. He was Philip, and he couldn't run away, not after everything that had happened. Everything that happened after this was on him, whether he liked it or not. He had to do something to set it right. He had told Briar Rose his life was in his hands, and he would keep his word. No magic, no way out of his marriage, and nothing to do about Maleficent. Well, at least he wasn't the knight in shiny armor he had never wanted to be. Except he had the sword and shield within closer reach than Maleficent did. Even if they were in the tent with the fairies, he could fix one mistake. Take some time to gather your things, and by the time Joanna awakens, the others and I will be asleep. Leave then, said Eris. Separate yourself from these troubles. Eris, wait, he said, and grabbed her arm. Is Briar Rose real? Her eyebrows pinched together. Who? Never before had one word given him so much hope. Never mind. She hesitated. You worried about me once, Philip. Sincerely worried about me. I am repaying that concern with my own. Leave tonight while my companions and I sleep, and stay out of your father's fight. She left the tent, and Philip collapsed, letting out a muffled scream into his hands. Philip couldn't face Joanna yet, not with his eyes still stinging and his shirt wet where he'd wiped his face. He wasn't sure how he would explain to her, or if he even could, that the fairies were on Maleficent's side and Eris was betraying them. How would he say that the past weeks of their lives had been not only a purposeful waste of time, but also a detrimental to their success? In one fell swoop, he had ruined everyone's plan except Maleficent's. He had robbed his father, effectively, when he took the sword from Barnaby, whom he definitely owed an apology to, and lied to Amos. Even though he had thought he was stealing the shield to defeat Maleficent, he doubted virtuous legends cared much for particulars. He'd gifted Maleficent exactly what she needed to win the upcoming war. He had to get the sword and shield. Eris's confession had changed everything, but leaving the sword and shield with the fairies was as inexcusable as everything else he'd done. They had magic, and he very much didn't. Simply running away was easy and reasonable, but Philip had never been described as reasonable. He quietly gathered up his and Joanna's belongings, trying not to wake her, and waited for a little while. It was still a long time until dawn, and Eris was sure to go back to sleep. The sword and shield were in the fairy's tent. He could get them once she fell asleep. They had won, or so they thought, so surely they would be celebrating with a full night's rest. Need enough energy for the gloating, he muttered, easing Joanna's book out from under her head. It was open, and the first few pages were folded in on each other. Carefully, Philip fixed the pages and smoothed them out against his chest. The first page was crinkled but readable. Unlegendary, untold but not unimportant. Not all great knights live on in stories, and not all great stories are truthful tales of good knights. Who we choose to forget says as much about us as we choose to remember. Philip stopped reading, ran a thumb across the title, scrawled in her overly careful hand, closed the book, and placed it into a secure little flap inside her pack. He had never taken Joanna as someone who would want to write histories, but many of the epics were history embellished. This fit her nearly perfectly, and it meant she wasn't writing about their own misadventures. Certain Eris would be asleep by now, Philip made his way outside with their belongings. Everything was packed save for Joanna's bedroll. She could do that easily enough. The horses were Philip's main concern, and he approached their sleeping forms slowly. Sprawled out on his side in the grass, Samson was chewing some dream food in his sleep, and Taliesin was standing a few strides from him. Philip clucked at him, and the horse opened one eye. Philip showed him the pack. "We're being sneaky, all right," Philip whispered, and let Taliesin shake himself out before loading him up. "We need a quiet and quick exit in a minute." Taliesin huffed. Philip patted his neck, promising to get Joanna as soon as it was safe. Taliesin nudged Samson with a hoof, and Philip shushed the large courser as he rose. Samson snuffled against Philip's shoulder. Philip kissed Samson's snout and set his pack and shoes next to him. "Wait here," he said, and pointed at Samson. "Breakfast once we're safe." Samson let out a soft nicker, and Philip turned to the fairy's tent. Without magic, he would have to move slowly. If anything went wrong, his only saving grace was that he could wield the sword and shield against the fairies, and they couldn't touch them, since being near the armaments didn't bother them. Sleeping near them was the easiest way to protect them. Philip hadn't questioned why they wanted to protect the arms when it was only the 5 of them. Eris's confession made it very clear, though. Philip had never been inside their tent. They kept the flap tightly drawn, the whole thing still prickling with magic whenever he went near it. At least he could still sense magic, but that didn't help him much. He knelt before the flap with his ear to the crack, and he listened. The muffled sounds of sleep, snoring and breathing and shifting blankets, drifted to him. Slowly he was able to pick out 3 different breathing styles. All 3 fairies sounded asleep. Philip took a deep breath and opened the tent flap. The fairies did love their beauty sleep. Eris was stretched out on her back across a pillowy-looking bedroll, and a silk scarf was tied over her eyes. Frank snored like a horse stampede while curled up in a nest of blankets that looked as if they were spun from the softest storm clouds. And Poana slept on a comfortable cot, tendrils of smoke curling out of her mouth with each exhale. They were on opposite sides of the tent, as if they couldn't stand to be near each other even when sleeping. In the center of the tent were the sword of truth and the shield of virtue, swaddled so tightly in blankets and rags that he could barely make out their shapes. The only light in the tent came from the sliver of shield still visible. Philip swallowed. The silence seemed brittle, as if the slightest sound would shatter it. He held his breath and stepped fully into the tent. His bare feet rustled across the rugs laid over the grass, and his heartbeat pounded in his ears. He stayed closer to Eris, certain she would be mad if she woke up, but wouldn't outright murder him for not following her directions. He took another slow step toward the center of the room, and the fairies didn't wake. Carefully, he began to unravel the sword and shield. They glittered in the dark starlight flickering across their silvery surfaces, and he slid his arm through the straps of the shield. It was warm, despite the cool night air, and the sword grip seemed to mold into his hand. Philip turned to leave. The rug beneath his feet rippled, and he froze. Eris shifted, raising one hand to her face. Philip prepared to run, but before he could, Frank choked and cleared her throat in her sleep. Eris sighed and threw her arm over her covered eyes. Poana didn't so much as move. Philip stayed still, his heart little more than a hollow knot in his throat. He had already failed terribly. He had to get the arms out of there and fix it. Being a useless knight was one thing. Being the downfall of humanity was another. He took a painful, slow step toward the tent flap, and no one moved. Another step. He held his breath again, and final, longer step. Nothing. Philip slipped sideways out of the tent, the sword and shield safely with him, and dashed to the horses. His hands shook, and fear scratched at the back of his neck. He listened for the fairies to give chase. They didn't. Philip kept the sword and shield in hand when he woke up Joanna. She took the betrayal as poorly as he had, stalking out to Taliesin with a scowl so frightening the horse backed away. Philip felt hollow explaining it, each trick and lie obvious now. Look, the most important thing we can do right now is get the sword and shield to Altor and far away from Maleficent, he said, desperate for her to know that he wasn't simply running away. He shoved the shield into her arms. We have 3 days until Princess Aurora's birthday, and it will take us that long to reach King Stefan's castle. Poana and Frank, maybe even Eris, will come after us once they realize we took the armaments. I don't think they can track us, or they would have found us immediately after the robbery. It will be safer if we split up. Then, if they do catch up, at least one of us will get there with one of the arms. Or you'll finally get to punch Poana in the face. That he wasn't going to do exactly as Eris wanted was something he could deal with later. Absolutely not, said Joanna. I'm not leaving you alone. You will. I'm not asking you to do this. I'm telling you to, said Philip. There are 2 roads to Altor from here, one around the woods and one through it. Joanna inhaled sharply and clenched her teeth. She held up a finger between them. Fine, but I'm going around. It's the easier, more common path, and they'll expect us to go that way, she whispered, poking him between each word. The pair led their horses from camp and waited until they were far away from before mounting up. Philip kept the sword, and Joanna carried the shield on her back. Do you trust Eris? She said. The concern in her voice killed him. Could this be another ploy? No and no, he said. Every time he had raised his hand to call forth his magic, had Eris been laughing at him? Every time he had confided in her about his fears and goals, had she made note of it to use against him later? Philip swallowed, but we'll find out how she feels when she notices the sword and shield are gone. Hopefully that won't be until dawn, and they won't be able to find us. Frank usually moved us to places. She never moved us magically to people. Maybe they can't track humans. Joanna took a deep breath and mumbled, "Hopefully. How are we going to explain this to your father?" Quickly, without leaving any pauses during which he can yell at me. He knew he deserved a reprimand, but he felt so empty that he wasn't sure it would make a difference. "Philip, be serious," she said. "We'll tell them everything," he said. That's more important than my pride." Joanna opened her mouth, stared at him, and closed it. Samson snorted. "You can all remark on how unlikely I was to ever utter those words once we're safe in Altor," said Philip. "I got us into this mess, but I can't leave us in it. Not now." He wanted to run and hide and never admit to any of it, but he couldn't. The Philip of a month earlier could have. Even with the lies and betrayal, Eris was right. Only he could control how he reacted to his circumstances and take charge of them. Eris had ruined him. He believed in himself now.